International landscape, analysis of the competitive positioning, Trump's economic agenda and its influence on trade relations with China and the EU by the end of 2025. Executive Summary. The re-election of Donald Trump as U.S. President in 2024 is set to significantly reshape international trade dynamics, particularly with China and the European Union (EU). His administration's anticipated aggressive economic agenda will likely exacerbate existing trade tensions, leading to a complex geopolitical landscape characterized by heightened tariffs, economic uncertainty, and strategic realignments. This analysis explores the potential ramifications of Trump's policies on trade relations with China and the EU by the end of 2025. Overview of Trump's economic agenda. Upon entering his second term in January 2025, Trump is expected to reinstate and escalate tariffs on imports, particularly targeting China and potentially extending punitive measures to other trading partners, including EU nations. His campaign rhetoric has suggested tariffs ranging from 10% to 20% on most imports and as high as 60% on Chinese goods, reviving a strategy reminiscent of his first term that aimed to reduce the U.S. trade deficit and bring manufacturing back to American soil. Trump's economic stance is built on the belief that trade wars can be beneficial and winnable, a sentiment he famously expressed during his first term. As he prepares to implement his policies, the implications for global trade are profound, particularly for nations heavily reliant on trade with the US and China. The EU's dilemma: aligning with the US or China? European leaders face a precarious situation as they attempt to navigate the pressures from both the US and China. Trump's aggressive trade tactics could push the EU into a lose-lose scenario where it must choose between aligning with US demands or maintaining its economic ties with China. This dilemma is intensified by the economic struggles currently plaguing key EU economies like Germany and France, which are already grappling with slow growth and high inflation. 1. Trade threats and economic fallout. Trump's threats to impose tariffs could lead to a significant influx of Chinese goods into the EU market, undermining European manufacturing. The potential for a trade war looms large, especially if the EU is perceived as not adequately supporting US initiatives against China. 2. Internal EU divisions. The EU's response to Trump's policies is complicated by internal divisions regarding China. Some member states, particularly those with significant economic ties to Beijing such as Germany and Hungary, are hesitant to support aggressive actions against China that could jeopardize their economic interests. 3. Increased defense spending. In response to US pressure, European leaders are also contemplating increasing defense spending to meet NATO commitments, further straining their economies. The need for a unified approach while managing diverse national interests adds an additional layer of complexity to EU decision-making. Trump's legal framework for trade actions. The Trump administration is expected to utilize various legal mechanisms to implement its trade agenda, including Section 301 tariffs. This provision allows the U.S. Trade Representative to impose tariffs on countries that engage in unfair trade practices. It was previously used to justify significant tariffs on Chinese imports and is likely to be a key tool in Trump's second term. Section 232 tariffs, originally used to justify tariffs on steel and aluminum imports based on national security concerns. This section could see expanded application to other sectors including automotive and technology. International Emergency Economic Powers Act (IEPA). Trump may invoke IEPA to implement tariffs swiftly without congressional approval, a tactic that could enable more drastic trade measures against multiple countries. Potential scenarios for EU-US-China relations. The complex interplay of Trump's policies with EU responses and China's strategic maneuvers leads to three potential scenarios for transatlantic and China-EU relations. 1. Grand bargain: 10% likelihood. In this best-case scenario, Trump may negotiate a deal with the EU that involves limiting tariffs in exchange for increased European purchases of U.S. goods and a tougher stance on China. This scenario, while optimistic, seems unlikely given Trump's historical rigidity and confrontational approach. 2. Managed mess 70% likelihood. This is the most plausible scenario where Trump reintroduces tariffs akin to those from his first term, leading to tit-for-tat responses from the EU. Both sides may avoid further escalation, but relations will remain strained, impacting broader geopolitical dynamics. 3. Perfect storm 20% likelihood. In this scenario, escalating tariffs lead to a full-blown trade war between the US and EU with significant economic repercussions for both regions. This could further alienate the EU from the US and drive European nations to seek closer ties with China, particularly as they grapple with economic stagnation. Conclusion: the need for European unity. As Trump embarks on a second term marked by aggressive economic policies, the EU faces a critical juncture. Its ability to respond effectively will depend on fostering unity among member states, balancing relations with both the US and China, and mitigating the impact of anticipated trade wars. The next few years will be crucial in determining whether the EU can navigate this complex landscape successfully, or if it will succumb to fragmentation and division in the face of external pressures. The path forward requires strategic foresight and collaboration as European nations work to protect their economic interests while maintaining a coherent stance in the increasingly competitive global environment shaped by Trump's policies. The anticipated return of Donald Trump to the presidency in January 2025 is set to significantly affect trade relations between the United States, China, and the European Union (EU), creating a complex and contentious geopolitical landscape. Trump's economic agenda, characterized by aggressive tariff strategies, poses challenges for both the EU and China, complicating their respective economic futures. Tariffs and trade dynamics. Trump's plan to impose broad tariffs ranging from 10 to 20% on most trading partners and up to 60% on China signals a potential resurgence of trade conflicts reminiscent of his first term. This aggressive stance has prompted concern among EU leaders, who are now forced to confront a precarious choice: either align closely with US demands and decouple from China, or risk facing retaliatory tariffs from the US if they choose to maintain their economic ties with Beijing. Counterintuitively, while Trump's trade rhetoric positions him against both China and the EU, the economic realities suggest that these tariffs could inadvertently harm US interests as well. For instance, imposing high tariffs on Chinese goods is likely to flood the EU market with cheaper Chinese products, undermining European manufacturing and potentially leading to a backlash against US products in retaliation. The EU's dilemma. The EU is caught in a lose-lose scenario where its reliance on Chinese goods clashes with the pressures exerted by the US to decouple economic ties. As European economies grapple with stagnation, the imposition of US tariffs could exacerbate their economic woes. Countries like France and Germany are particularly vulnerable, with both facing significant economic challenges that limit their ability to respond to US demands effectively. The anxiety among EU leaders is palpable, as seen during the World Economic Forum discussions, where concerns about Trump's trade policies dominated the agenda. The EU's internal divisions complicate its response to Trump. Nations such as Germany and Hungary, which have cultivated close ties with China, may resist aligning with US policies that seek to impose tariffs or restrict Chinese investments. This fragmentation within the EU presents an opportunity for Trump to exploit divisions, potentially weakening the bloc's collective bargaining power. Legal framework for tariff increases. Trump's administration is expected to leverage various legal mechanisms to implement tariff increases. Key provisions such as Section 301 and Section 232, which were extensively utilized during his first term, will likely be employed again to justify aggressive tariff actions against both China and the EU. The legal framework allows the US to impose tariffs based on perceived unfair trade practices, which could lead to significant shifts in trade relations not just with China but also with European allies. Prospective scenarios for 2025. Looking ahead, 3 primary scenarios could unfold in transatlantic relations. 1. Grand bargain 10% chance. In a best-case scenario for Europe, Trump might agree to limit tariffs in exchange for increased European defense spending and greater alignment on China. However, this scenario appears unlikely given Trump's historical animosity towards European trade practices and his unwavering commitment to his tariff agenda. 2. Managed mess 70% chance. This scenario envisions a return to a tit-for-tat trade dynamic where both the US and the EU impose tariffs on each other's goods without escalating into a full-blown trade war. This outcome could lead to economic stagnation in both regions, but with a degree of cooperation remaining intact. 3. Perfect storm 20% chance. The worst-case scenario includes widespread US tariffs against the EU, severe cuts in US support for Ukraine, and a fracturing of NATO cooperation. This would likely result in significant political backlash within Europe and further complications in US-China relations, as the EU may seek to negotiate directly with Beijing to mitigate the fallout from US policies. Geopolitical implications and counterintuitive outcomes. Trump's return to power may also lead to unexpected geopolitical shifts. For instance, while he positions himself as a staunch opponent of China, his administration's actions could inadvertently push Europe to seek closer ties with Beijing as a counterbalance to US pressures. This would not only complicate US foreign policy but could also undermine the West's collective stance against China. Moreover, Trump's rhetoric and policies could foster a re-evaluation of globalization. Countries may begin to embrace more protectionist stances in response to heightened US tariffs, leading to a fragmentation of global supply chains that could ultimately harm US businesses reliant on those chains. Conclusion. As Trump embarks on his second term, the implications for trade relations with China and the EU are profound and multifaceted. The anticipated tariff increases and aggressive economic policies are likely to reshape not only economic landscapes but also geopolitical alliances. While the US may seek to leverage its position to extract concessions from both China and the EU, the counterintuitive dynamics of global trade may lead to unintended consequences that could complicate US objectives and foster new alignments in the international arena. Within the context of Donald Trump's second term beginning in January 2025, the dynamics of international trade relations, especially concerning the EU and China, will be heavily influenced by a complex interplay of aggressive tariff policies, geopolitical maneuvering, and the economic vulnerabilities of European nations. The significance of various elements in the analysis often gets overshadowed by the immediate focus on tariffs and trade wars. Overlooked elements and their significance. 1. Legal mechanisms for tariff implementation. One critical aspect that might be overlooked is the specific legal frameworks Trump plans to utilize to impose tariffs. The detailed discussion of laws such as Section 301 and Section 232 as outlined in the Perkins-Coie report underscores not just the intent to raise tariffs but the procedural pathways available. This is significant because understanding these mechanisms provides insights into how quickly and effectively Trump can implement his policies. The legal nuances also suggest that while Trump may promise aggressive tariffs, the actual timeline and scale of implementation could vary, affecting market expectations and investment decisions. 2. The EU's internal division. The analysis reveals a stark reality regarding the EU's internal division over its approach to China and the US. This division, noted in the Politico article, is not merely an operational issue but a fundamental challenge to EU unity. Countries like Germany and Hungary exhibit reluctance to align too closely with US policy, fearing economic repercussions from China. This split can lead to a fragmented European response to Trump's policies, making the EU a less formidable bloc in negotiations, which could ultimately benefit Trump's agenda. The significance lies in how this division could weaken the EU's negotiating power and result in inconsistent policies across member states, which may be exploited by both the US and China. 3. European economic vulnerabilities. The precarious economic situations in key EU countries, particularly France and Germany, are highlighted but may not receive the attention they warrant. As the Politico report discusses, Germany is facing unprecedented shrinkage in GDP and France is grappling with political instability. This context is crucial as it suggests that the EU may be less able to withstand economic pressures from the US than in previous years. The significance here is that European leaders may feel compelled to acquiesce to US demands to secure economic stability, thereby limiting their ability to resist Trump's trade agenda. 4. Geopolitical tensions beyond trade. The interplay between trade policies and geopolitical tensions is often simplified in discussions about US-China relations. The Rhodium Group report touches on Trump's potential foreign policy direction, including the implications for NATO and US commitments to Ukraine. The significance lies in understanding that economic negotiations cannot be viewed in isolation. They are deeply intertwined with security concerns. The EU's reliance on US military support complicates its response to trade pressures as leaders may prioritize security over economic sovereignty. 5. Potential for economic retaliation from China. The possibility of a flood of Chinese goods into the EU market as a result of Trump's tariffs on China is mentioned, but the broader economic implications of this are profound. If the US imposes high tariffs on Chinese imports, it may lead to retaliatory measures from Beijing against European goods, further straining EU economies already under pressure. The significance here is twofold. It highlights the interconnected nature of global trade and the potential for economic fallout that extends beyond US-China relations into European markets, which could exacerbate existing economic issues. 6. Shifts in global supply chains. The report indicates that Trump's tariffs could reshape global supply chains, yet the long-term impacts on European manufacturing competitiveness are subtle. European industries that rely on Chinese parts or exports could face significant disruptions. The significance is that many European companies may need to invest heavily in diversifying their supply chains away from China, which could lead to increased costs and diminished competitiveness in the short term. This could also accelerate the trend of reshoring or moving manufacturing back to Europe, fundamentally altering the landscape of international trade. 7. Potential for bilateral agreements. The prospect of Trump favoring bilateral agreements over multilateral ones could reshape not just US-EU relations but also how the EU engages with China. The Rhodium Group highlights that Trump's approach may encourage EU member states to pursue their own bilateral agreements with the US or China, potentially undercutting EU cohesion. The significance of this strategy lies in its potential to fracture the EU's collective bargaining power and lead to a fragmented approach to trade policy that benefits the US and China, as individual countries may prioritize national interests over collective EU goals. 8. Public sentiment and political ramifications. The political atmosphere within the EU as leaders react to Trump's policies is crucial yet often overlooked. The rise of populism and anti-establishment sentiments could lead to political instability within the EU, as governments face pressure to respond decisively to US demands or economic hardships. The significance here is that political instability could further complicate the EU's ability to respond cohesively to external pressures, and the rise of populist leaders aligned with Trump's agenda could shift the EU's political landscape dramatically. Conclusion. The intricate web of tariff strategies, internal EU divisions, economic vulnerabilities, and geopolitical considerations creates a complex environment for international trade relations as Trump embarks on his second term. Each of these overlooked elements carries significant weight in understanding the broader implications for both the EU and China. As such, stakeholders, including businesses, policymakers, and analysts, must navigate this landscape with a nuanced perspective, recognizing that the interplay of these factors will shape the future of global trade relations well into 2025 and beyond. 1. Trump's tariff strategy and its implications for trade relations. Trump's economic agenda, characterized by aggressive tariff policies, is likely to reshape trade dynamics significantly. The proposed tariffs of 10 to 20% on most trading partners and up to 60% on China indicate a return to the confrontational trade approach seen during his first term. This could lead to a resurgence of trade conflicts, particularly with the EU, as European leaders scramble to respond. The potential for retaliatory measures from the EU, coupled with the expectation of a flood of Chinese goods into the EU market, threatens to further destabilize transatlantic relations and create economic strain within the EU, particularly for manufacturing sectors. 2. The EU's dilemma: aligning with the US or China. The EU faces a precarious situation as it must choose between aligning with US demands for decoupling from China or maintaining its economic ties with Beijing. This lose-lose scenario puts pressure on EU unity, with member states deeply divided over how to handle their economic reliance on China. The economic turmoil in key EU economies such as France and Germany complicates their ability to respond to US demands effectively. The internal divisions may weaken the EU's negotiating power and lead to uneven responses to US pressures, highlighting the strategic challenges the bloc faces in navigating US-China tensions. 3. Legal mechanisms for tariff imposition. Trump's administration may utilize various legal frameworks such as Section 301 and Section 232 to impose tariffs and alter trade policies. These legal mechanisms provide a structured approach for the U.S. to enact tariffs based on claims of unfair trade practices. The implications of these measures extend beyond immediate tariff increases. They could fundamentally alter the international trade landscape by creating a more unilateral U.S. trade policy approach. The potential for significant shifts in relations with China and the EU driven by the application of these legal frameworks underscores the broader geopolitical ramifications of U.S. trade actions. 4. Impact on EU-China relations. The anticipated tariff increases on China could lead to a diversion of Chinese exports to the EU, which may prompt Brussels to respond with its own trade defense measures. This scenario suggests a deterioration in EU-China relations exacerbated by Trump's confrontational stance. While the EU may seek to maintain some level of engagement with China, the pressure to align with US policies could lead to increased tensions and a fragmented approach within the EU. The interplay between US tariffs, EU responses, and Chinese retaliatory actions creates a complex web of trade relations that could have lasting implications for global trade dynamics. 1. The Smoot-Hawley Tariff Act of 1930. This legislation raised US tariffs on over 20,000 imported goods in an attempt to protect American industry during the Great Depression. The act led to retaliatory tariffs from other countries, resulting in a significant decline in international trade and exacerbating the economic downturn. It serves as a historical example of how aggressive tariff policies can destabilize global economic relations. 2. The US-China trade war 2018-present, initiated during President Trump's first term. The trade war involved the imposition of tariffs on hundreds of billions of dollars worth of goods between the US and China. The conflict was characterized by retaliatory tariffs, trade negotiations, and economic tensions that affected global supply chains. This ongoing situation illustrates the complexities of modern trade relations and the potential for tariffs to impact international alliances and economic stability. 3. The European Union's response to U.S. steel and aluminum tariffs 2018. In response to Trump's imposition of tariffs on steel and aluminum imports, the EU enacted retaliatory tariffs on a list of American goods including motorcycles, bourbon, and jeans. This conflict highlighted the fragility of transatlantic trade relations and the challenges faced by the EU in balancing its economic interests with the need to respond to U.S. trade policies. The situation reflects the broader implications of unilateral trade actions on international partnerships. As Donald Trump embarks on his anticipated second term as president in January 2025, the international landscape, especially trade relations with China and the European Union (EU), is expected to undergo significant shifts influenced by Trump's aggressive economic agenda. This analysis outlines the competitive positioning of these relations and offers predictions for the future. particularly focusing on the implications of Trump's policies by the end of 2025. Predictions for trade relations with China and the EU. 1. Escalation of tariff wars. Trump's return to the White House is likely to reignite tariff wars reminiscent of his first term. Reports indicate that he may impose tariffs ranging from 10% to as high as 60% on Chinese imports and similarly aggressive tariffs on EU goods. This could lead to retaliatory measures from both China and European nations, resulting in a full-blown trade conflict. The EU, already facing economic challenges, may struggle to respond effectively to such tariffs, leading to a managed mess scenario where tit-for-tat tariffs become the norm. 2. Impact on global trade flows. Should Trump follow through with universal tariffs on China, it could reshape global trade dynamics, creating a flood of cheaper Chinese goods in the EU market as companies divert exports to avoid US tariffs. This influx could severely undermine European manufacturing, leading to economic stagnation within the EU and heightened tensions between the US and European nations. 3. Divided EU response. The EU is likely to face internal divisions regarding its response to US trade policies. Countries like Germany and France may push back against stringent measures against China, while Eastern European nations might align more closely with US policy due to security concerns. This disunity could hinder the EU's ability to present a cohesive front against US tariffs, complicating its trade strategy and potentially leading to concessions that favor US interests. 4. Increased defense spending. Trump's demands for increased defense spending from European allies will likely be a significant component of his agenda. As European leaders scramble to meet US expectations, the pressure to allocate more resources to defense could strain public budgets and limit funds available for domestic economic recovery. 5. Geopolitical repercussions. The anticipated trade tensions are not merely economic, they will have far-reaching geopolitical implications. The EU may find itself caught in a strategic dilemma, having to choose between strengthening ties with the US or maintaining economic relations with China. Such a predicament could lead to shifting alliances and increased geopolitical fragmentation, with countries reassessing their positions based on economic and security needs. 6. Legal mechanisms for tariffs. Trump's administration is expected to utilize various legal frameworks such as Section 301 and Section 232 to impose tariffs and other trade restrictions. This could lead to significant changes in the US-China trade relationship, with the potential for long-term impacts on international trade law and norms. Scenarios for the future. 1. Grand bargain 10% chance. In a best-case scenario, Trump could negotiate a deal with the EU that prevents widespread tariffs in exchange for commitments on defense spending and cooperation against China. This scenario would likely involve the EU making substantial concessions to avoid economic fallout, allowing for a more stable transatlantic relationship. 2. Managed mess 70% chance. The most likely scenario involves a series of incremental tariff increases and retaliatory measures, leading to a strained but not entirely broken relationship between the US and the EU. In this scenario, both sides may engage in limited negotiations to avoid further escalation, but underlying tensions would persist, complicating future collaborations. 3. Perfect storm 20% chance. This worst-case scenario would see Trump imposing sweeping tariffs on the EU and China, leading to a significant breakdown in relations. The US might withdraw support for NATO and Ukraine, creating a vacuum that could embolden adversarial actions from both Russia and China. The EU would face immense economic pressure, potentially leading to political instability and a rise in populism. Conclusion. By the end of 2025, Trump's economic agenda is poised to significantly reshape trade relations with both China and the EU, creating an environment characterized by heightened tensions, economic uncertainty, and geopolitical complexities. As the EU grapples with internal divisions and external pressures, its ability to navigate this challenging landscape will be crucial. The potential for a variety of scenarios underscores the importance of strategic decision-making from European leaders and the need for a unified approach to mitigate the risks associated with Trump's aggressive trade policies.